Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting through centuries of human ambition, from sketches that imagined flight before the sky was conquered, to armor polished for honor, to festivals where order briefly collapsed, and to power that dared to speak too loudly. This is not a straight line of history. It's a quiet record of how far humans have dared to go. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes. Let the noise of today fade, and allow history to whisper you to sleep. Long before engines learned to roar, long before wings trusted the sky, there lived a man who worked in silence, guided not by applause, but by curiosity. His name was Leonardo da Vinci, and tonight we do not meet him as a genius, a master, or a legend, but simply as a quiet observer of the world. Imagine a dimly lit room in Renaissance Italy, the air thick with the smell of ink and parchment, where a single candle flickers beside stacks of fragile paper. On those pages, the future waits patiently, sketched in careful lines, never demanding to be built, only to be understood. Leonardo did not wake each day thinking of invention as we understand it today. He did not rush to create machines for glory or profit. Instead, he watched. He watched birds rise and fall against the wind. He watched water curl and twist around stones. He watched muscles tighten beneath skin and light dissolve into shadow at dusk. To Leonardo, nature was not chaotic. It was precise, intentional, and quietly mathematical. And so his inventions were never truly inventions at all. They were conversations with nature, written down before the world was ready to listen. As you settle deeper into this story, it is important to let go of the modern image of Leonardo as a man racing ahead of his time with certainty and confidence. In truth, he moved slowly. His notebooks reveal hesitation, revisions, questions scribbled in the margins. He sketched flying machines not because he believed humans would conquer the sky tomorrow, but because he sensed that flight followed rules that could be learned. When Leonardo drew his aerial screw, a spiral meant to rise into the air, he was not declaring victory over gravity. He was asking it a question. What if air behaved like water? What if motion itself could lift us upward? These were not designs meant for workshops. They were thoughts made visible, ideas resting gently on paper, waiting for centuries to pass before anyone could test them. Leonardo's mind ran faster than history, not because it sprinted, but because history walked carefully, bound by fear, tradition, and limited tools. The world around him was not ready for gears that calculated motion or wings that imitated birds. Metal was heavy, power sources were weak, society itself resisted change. Yet Leonardo continued to draw, to observe, to record, as if he knew that time itself would one day catch up. His notebooks became quiet vessels, carrying ideas forward through centuries of darkness, war, and forgetting. Many of his designs were never constructed in his lifetime. Some were not even discovered until long after his death. And yet their existence alone changed something fundamental. They expanded the boundaries of what humans believed was possible. There is something deeply calming in realizing that Leonardo did not fail simply because his machines were never built. He succeeded by imagining a world that did not yet exist, without demanding to live in it. His work reminds us that progress is not always loud, and genius is not always rewarded immediately. In the gentle rhythm of his sketches, we find a different measure of success, not completion, but contribution, not recognition, but resonance. As Leonardo studied the flow of water and the structure of bones, he was laying the groundwork for fields that would not be named for centuries: aerodynamics, anatomy, engineering, biomimicry, all sleeping quietly within his pages, like seeds waiting for the right season. And so, as the night grows quieter around you, consider this thought, offered without urgency. How many ideas in human history were born too early? How many brilliant visions rested in drawers, forgotten simply because the world was not ready to receive them? Leonardo's life invites us to see history not as a straight path of progress, but as a slow unfolding, where some minds open doors long before anyone knows how to walk through them. Tonight, we begin not with machines, but with patience, with a man who trusted time more than recognition, and who understood that even unfinished ideas could reshape the future, quietly, long after the candle had burned out. As the night deepens, we move closer to the heart of Leonardo's thinking, to the place where his inventions truly began. Not in workshops or courts, not among patrons or rulers, but outdoors, in fields, rivers, and the open sky. Leonardo da Vinci believed that nature never wasted effort. Every curve of a leaf, every spiral of water, every bone beneath the skin served a purpose. To him, the world was not something to conquer, but something to learn from. And so, when Leonardo imagined machines, he did not force ideas upon the world. He listened first. He watched how birds adjusted their wings in changing air. He noticed how fish moved effortlessly through water without resistance. He observed how branches bent under weight rather than snapping. In these quiet observations, a philosophy emerged, one that modern science would later call biomimicry, though Leonardo never needed a name for it. For him, imitation was not copying, it was understanding. Leonardo's notebooks reveal this approach in gentle detail. His sketches of wings were not rigid structures, but flexible forms, inspired by feathers that layered and shifted with the wind. He understood that flight was not about power alone, but balance. His flying machines were designed with careful attention to weight, airflow, and movement, all borrowed from the natural world. Even when these designs could not yet leave the ground, they carried within them a truth that would resurface centuries later: that the most efficient solutions already existed around us, hidden in plain sight. Leonardo's genius was not that he invented new laws of physics, but that he recognized patterns long before others thought to look for them. This same philosophy guided his mechanical designs. When Leonardo drew gears and levers, he did not imagine them as cold, lifeless parts. He saw them as extensions of muscles and joints. The human body, in his eyes, was the most elegant machine ever created. Bones became beams, tendons became cables, joints became hinges. By studying anatomy with unmatched precision, Leonardo learned how force traveled through structure, how motion flowed naturally when nothing resisted it. His machines mirrored these principles, favoring smooth transitions over abrupt force. Even today, engineers study his sketches not for direct blueprints, but for insight. They sense that his designs feel alive, because they were born from living systems. Leonardo's relationship with nature also shaped how he thought about time. He knew that rivers carved stone not through strength, but persistence. that trees grew not by rushing upward, but by anchoring deeply first. In this way, his inventions were patient. They did not demand immediate success. They existed as long-term conversations with the future. When Leonardo studied water flow, he was not only interested in canals or pumps, he was fascinated by movement itself, by how chaos could produce order. His swirling diagrams of water resemble galaxies, storms, and blood vessels alike, suggesting a belief that the same rules governed all things. To Leonardo, understanding one system meant glimpsing them all. There is something profoundly restful in this way of thinking. Leonardo did not separate art from science or invention from observation. Everything belonged to the same quiet whole. His machines were drawn with the same care as his paintings, shaded gently, balanced thoughtfully, as if even mechanical ideas deserved beauty. This approach slowed him down. It made his work less practical in the short term, but infinitely richer in meaning. He was not racing to build the first machine. He was learning how the world worked, one detail at a time. And in doing so, he left behind ideas that would awaken generations later when tools and minds finally caught up. As you listen, perhaps growing more relaxed with each word, consider how different this is from how we often think of progress today. Faster, bigger, louder. Leonardo reminds us of another path, a quieter one, a path where observation precedes action, where patience shapes invention, and where the natural world is not an obstacle, but a guide. Many of his designs never moved beyond the page, yet their influence moved through centuries. They taught humanity to look again, to see wisdom not only in books, but in birds, water, and bone. And perhaps that is the most enduring invention Leonardo ever offered. Not a machine, but a way of seeing, one that whispers rather than shouts, and endures long after the ink has faded. As the story continues, we arrive at a quiet and often misunderstood chapter in the life of Leonardo da Vinci. It is the chapter of machines that were never built. To modernize, this can feel like absence, like incompletion, like ideas that somehow failed to become real. But in Leonardo's world, the page itself was a destination. His notebooks were not waiting rooms for construction. They were places where thought could exist freely, without the pressure of completion. In an age when most craftsmen worked toward immediate utility, Leonardo allowed himself something rare and radical. He allowed ideas to remain ideas. When we look at his designs for war machines, for bridges, for mechanical knights and complex gear systems, it is tempting to ask why so few of them left the paper. The answers are quiet and layered. Some were impossible with the materials of the time. Others required precision that Renaissance tools could not yet achieve. And some, perhaps, were never meant to be built at all. Leonardo understood that imagination could outrun capability, and he did not see that as a flaw. To him, the distance between thought and execution was not a gap to be closed hastily, but a space where understanding could deepen. Consider his armored vehicle, often described as an early tank. It appears formidable, encased in slanted armor, bristling with weapons. Yet careful study reveals something curious. The gears inside are arranged in a way that would cause the machine to jam if built exactly as drawn. Some historians believe this was an error. Others suggest something more deliberate. Leonardo may have intentionally designed it to be unworkable, wary of placing too much destructive power into the wrong hands. If this is true, then his restraint becomes as meaningful as his imagination. It suggests a man who understood not only what could be built, but what should perhaps remain theoretical. Leonardo's notebooks also contain designs that blur the line between machine and metaphor. His mechanical lion, created to walk and open its chest to reveal flowers, was not meant to change industry or warfare. It was a gesture, a symbol, a moment of wonder. In these designs, Leonardo reminds us that invention is not always about efficiency. Sometimes it is about curiosity, delight, and the human desire to animate the inanimate. These machines were performances on paper, rehearsals for futures that might never arrive, yet still mattered deeply. As the night grows quieter, there is comfort in recognizing that Leonardo was not chasing productivity as we define it today. He left projects unfinished, not from carelessness, but from abundance. His mind moved from one curiosity to another, following threads wherever they led. In this way, his notebooks resemble landscapes rather than blueprints. You wander through them, you pause, you return later. There is no single path to follow, no final product demanded, just exploration layered upon exploration, resting together in ink and thought. Many of Leonardo's ideas slept for centuries. His concepts of bearings, cranes, hydraulic systems, and flying devices waited patiently in archives, rediscovered by minds equipped with new tools and perspectives. When engineers later encountered his work, they felt a strange familiarity, as if Leonardo had been thinking alongside them across time. His machines did not fail because they were unfinished. They succeeded because they expanded imagination. They made it acceptable to think beyond immediate reach, to design without certainty, to explore without urgency. In a world that often measures value by output, Leonardo offers a gentler lesson. Not everything meaningful must be completed. Some ideas exist to open doors rather than to walk through them. Some designs serve as questions rather than answers. As you rest with this thought, let it settle without resistance. The night does not rush toward morning, and Leonardo did not rush toward conclusion. His legacy lives not only in what was built, but in what was dared, in the courage to imagine freely, even when history was not ready to follow. And perhaps that is why his machines, though silent on paper, still speak so clearly to us now, whispering that incompletion is not always loss, and that sometimes the most powerful inventions are the ones that teach us how to think. As we reach the final moments of this chapter, the room around Leonardo grows quiet once more. The candle burns low. The pages lie still. And yet, something extraordinary is about to happen, not in his lifetime, but far beyond it. Leonardo da Vinci did not live to see his flying machines rise into the sky, nor his mechanical ideas take form in iron and steel. He passed away believing, perhaps, that many of his thoughts would remain only thoughts. But history, patient and unpredictable, had other plans. Centuries later, his notebooks began to awaken, not all at once, but slowly, like seeds responding to a long-awaited season. When scholars rediscovered Leonardo's writings, they did not find outdated curiosities. They found familiarity. Bearings that reduced friction, gear systems that mirrored modern mechanics, studies of airflow that echoed the principles of aerodynamics, observations of the human body that prefigured biomechanics. What had once been quiet sketches became points of reference, moments of recognition. Engineers, scientists, and artists alike sensed that Leonardo had been standing where they now stood, gazing forward with the same questions. His ideas did not belong to the 15th century alone. They belonged to anyone willing to look deeply. There was a profound calm in realizing that Leonardo's influence did not depend on speed. His legacy unfolded slowly, almost invisibly. It did not arrive as a sudden revolution, but as a steady presence, resurfacing whenever humanity paused to ask how things truly worked. In moments of scientific breakthrough, Leonardo's spirit appeared not as instruction, but as encouragement. Look closer, observe longer, learn from nature. These quiet principles guided generations that never knew his voice, yet followed his way of thinking. What makes this legacy especially soothing to contemplate is that Leonardo never demanded credit. His notebooks were not published manifestos, they were private companions. He did not design for applause or recognition, and so when the world finally caught up, it felt less like rediscovery and more like reunion, as if humanity had returned to a conversation interrupted by time. His ideas fit naturally into modern understanding because they were never bound to a single era. They were grounded in patterns that endure, in truths that remain constant no matter the century. As you listen, perhaps drifting closer to rest, consider how different this is from the way we often measure success. Leonardo did not build empires or dominate industries. He did not complete every project or finish every idea. Yet his influence reaches quietly into countless fields, from engineering to medicine, from art to architecture. His genius lived not in products, but in perspective. He taught the world how to see connections where others saw separation, how to find unity between water and air, muscle and machine, beauty and function. And so the true invention Leonardo left behind may not be any single machine. It may be the permission to think patiently, to accept that some ideas require time beyond a single lifetime, to understand that being ahead of one's time does not mean rushing forward, but trusting that the future will arrive when it is ready. Leonardo's life reminds us that history is not a race and progress is not a demand. It is a quiet unfolding, shaped by minds willing to observe, imagine, and then let go. As this chapter comes to rest, allow that thought to settle gently. Somewhere in the past, a man sketched the future without needing to see it realized. Somewhere in the present, we benefit from ideas that once slept in darkness. And somewhere in the quiet space between thought and time, Leonardo's legacy continues, not loudly, but faithfully, whispering that even unfinished ideas can change the world, long after their creator has closed his eyes.
In medieval Europe, honor did not live quietly in the heart, hidden like a private belief or an unspoken vow. Honor was something that needed to be seen. It was worn on the body, stitched into fabric, polished into metal, and displayed before a watching crowd. As night settles gently around us, imagine a wide tournament field just beyond the walls of a stone city. Banners move slowly in the breeze. Trumpets sound, not sharply, but ceremonially. This is not merely a place of combat, it is a stage, a carefully prepared scene where identity itself will be performed. Knights arrive not simply as warriors, but as symbols, wrapped in layers of meaning that begin long before the first lance is lowered. Clothing at medieval tournaments was never accidental. Every color, every texture, every emblem carried a message. Rich fabrics signaled lineage and wealth, while specific patterns hinted at allegiance and personal history. A knight's surcoat flowing over armor often bore heraldic symbols that told a story older than the man wearing them. Lions, crosses, fleur-de-lis, and geometric shapes spoke of family honor, regional loyalty, and inherited duty. To the watching crowd, these symbols were instantly recognizable, like names spoken without sound. Before a knight proved himself in combat, he had already been judged by what he wore. In this way, clothing became language, and the tournament became a conversation conducted through fabric and steel. Beneath these garments lay armor, gleaming and heavy, shaped not only for protection, but for impression. Polished plate reflected sunlight, turning the night into a moving spectacle. Helmets were sculpted with ridges and crests that added height and presence, making the wearer appear larger, stronger, almost unreal. Yet beneath the metal was a human body, vulnerable and fragile, aware of every risk. Armor did not erase fear, it concealed it. The weight of steel pressed down on shoulders and chest, reminding the knight of both his duty and his mortality. Each breath inside the helmet was loud and close, a private sound hidden beneath public glory. Tournaments were often described as games or celebrations, but this description softens their reality. They were controlled violence, ritualized danger, designed to transform real risk into symbolic triumph. Knights could, and often did, die in these events. A misaligned lance, a fall from a horse, a crack in armor could end a life instantly. Yet the crowd gathered eagerly, drawn by the shimmer of spectacle and the promise of honor made visible. In this setting, bravery was not only about survival, it was about being seen. To ride forward, fully armored, fully displayed, was to accept that one's worth would be measured in moments witnessed by others. As the night deepens, it becomes easier to sense the quiet tension beneath the pageantry. Knights did not simply wear armor to protect themselves, they wore it to transform themselves. The gleam of metal and the richness of cloth created distance between the inner self and the outer role. Inside, there was uncertainty, exhaustion, and fear. Outside, there was confidence, elegance, and resolve. The tournament allowed this transformation to feel real, even if only for a day. When the crowd cheered, the performance succeeded. Honor briefly became tangible. This is why medieval tournaments held such power over the imagination of their time. They offered a way to turn fragile human bodies into enduring symbols. Clothing and armor did not just cover the knight, they told the world who he was meant to be. And yet, as history often reminds us, the shine of spectacle can distract from the cost beneath it. The armor that dazzled the eye also bruised the skin. The symbols that promised glory also demanded sacrifice. Honor, when worn like a costume, required constant maintenance, constant risk, constant exposure. As you listen, perhaps growing more relaxed with each word, consider the quiet truth beneath the glamour. Medieval society did not hide its admiration for what was beautiful and impressive. It celebrated it openly. But history, patient and observant, remembers more than shine. It remembers the weight carried beneath the metal, the breath caught inside the helmet, the fragile human form moving bravely into danger, not only to fight, but to be recognized. In this world of tournaments and pageantry, honor was never abstract. It was visible, wearable, and costly. And it is in this tension between splendor and vulnerability that the deeper story of medieval tournaments begins to unfold.
As the tournament field settles into its rhythm, there is another layer to notice, one that speaks without words and lingers long after the clash of steel fades. In medieval tournaments, armor and clothing did more than protect the body or impress the crowd. They spoke a language of symbols, a language understood instinctively by those who lived within it. Colors, shapes, and emblems formed a visual code that revealed lineage, allegiance, ambition, and reputation. Before a knight ever raised a lance, his identity had already been announced in silence. Heraldry transformed armor into biography, turning the human figure into a moving record of history and expectation. Colors carried meaning that went far beyond decoration. Deep reds suggested courage and sacrifice, but also blood willingly offered for honor. Blues spoke of loyalty and steadfastness, qualities prized in a world bound by oaths. Gold signaled wealth, divine favor, or proximity to power, shimmering as a reminder that not all knights stood on equal ground. Even black, often associated with mourning, could suggest resolve, mystery, or defiance. These choices were rarely random. They were deliberate statements made visible, ensuring that a knight's presence was understood before his actions were judged. Symbols completed this visual language. Animals, plants, geometric forms, and sacred signs adorned shields and surcoats, each carrying inherited meaning. A lion might declare bravery and authority. An eagle could suggest vision and dominance. A simple cross connected the knight's personal risk to a larger spiritual narrative, transforming physical danger into sacred duty. These symbols were often inherited, passed down through generations, linking the present moment to an ancestral past. To wear such a symbol was to carry not only personal ambition, but the weight of family memory and expectation. In this way, medieval tournaments became gatherings not just of individuals, but of histories. When knights rode into the arena, they brought with them stories older than themselves. Their armor announced where they came from, whom they served, and what they were expected to defend. The crowd did not need introductions. They read these details instinctively, responding with cheers or silence based on recognition. Honor here was collective. A single failure could stain a lineage. A single triumph could elevate a family's name for decades. Yet beneath this rich symbolism lay a quieter truth. The more meaning armor carried, the heavier it became, not only in weight but in expectation. Knights were not free to simply survive. They were expected to perform in accordance with the story written upon them. The symbols they wore shaped how others saw them, but also how they saw themselves. To fail publicly was not just personal disappointment, it was a rupture in the narrative they represented. And so the visual language of tournaments, so beautiful and refined, quietly intensified pressure and risk. As night deepens around us, there is something restful in observing this distance between appearance and reality. From afar, the tournament seems orderly, colorful, almost theatrical. Up close, it is intimate and tense. Sweat gathers beneath padded garments. Vision narrows behind helmet slits. Breathing becomes shallow. The polished symbols remain calm and composed, even as the body beneath them struggles. In this contrast, medieval society revealed a deep understanding of spectacle. Beauty was not meant to erase danger, it was meant to frame it, to give it meaning. This language of armor reminds us that humans have long sought ways to make risk acceptable, even noble, by surrounding it with symbolism. When danger is wrapped in color and ritual, it becomes easier to face. The tournament did not deny fragility, it concealed it behind layers of meaning, and in doing so, it allowed individuals to step into roles larger than themselves, if only briefly. As you continue to rest with this thought, consider how much of history is written not only in actions, but in appearances carefully chosen. Medieval armor, with all its shine and symbolism, tells us that honor was never invisible. It was constructed, displayed, and maintained through constant effort. And beneath every emblem, every color,
every polished surface, there was a human heart beating quietly, hoping to live up to the story it wore. As the tournament day unfolds, another presence quietly shapes everything that happens within the lists. It is not carried on horseback, nor forged in metal. It is the crowd. Medieval tournaments did not exist in isolation. Without witnesses, without eyes to observe and remember, honor itself would dissolve into something private and fragile. Glamour, ritual, and display were not excess, they were necessities. The watching crowd gave meaning to every polished surface and every risky charge. In this shared space, bravery only became honor when it was seen. The arrival of spectators transformed the tournament from combat into ceremony. Nobles gathered beneath canopies, their clothing echoing the colors and symbols worn by the knights below. Merchants, artisans, and villagers filled the edges of the field, drawn by the promise of spectacle and story. For many, this was not merely entertainment, it was education. It was how values were learned and reinforced. Courage, loyalty, and sacrifice were not abstract ideas. They were embodied, enacted, and rewarded before a living audience. The tournament became a mirror through which society recognized itself. Ritual guided every movement, from the procession of knights into the arena to the formal salute before combat. Each action followed a script older than any individual present. These rituals slowed time, creating a sense of order and inevitability. They reassured the crowd that danger was contained, even as it unfolded. By framing violence within ceremony, medieval society made it bearable, even beautiful. The clash of lances became meaningful not because it was safe, but because it followed rules that elevated risk into honor. Glamour played a crucial role in this transformation. The shine of armor, the flutter of banners, the rhythmic sound of hooves on packed earth all worked together to captivate the senses. This sensory richness softened the harshness of combat, allowing the audience to focus on form rather than consequence. A fall could be tragic, but it was also dramatic. A victory could be fleeting, but it was remembered. Glamour did not erase suffering, it reframed it, turning pain into narrative and loss into legend. For the knights themselves, the presence of the crowd was both empowering and oppressive. Cheers could strengthen resolve, while silence could wound more deeply than steel. Every movement was observed, interpreted, and remembered. A moment of hesitation might linger in memory longer than a successful strike. In this way, the tournament bound personal identity tightly to public perception. A knight did not fight only for survival. He fought for recognition, for story, for a place in the collective memory of those watching. As the evening lights softened and shadows lengthened across the field, the emotional weight of the spectacle grew heavier. The crowd did not see the bruises forming beneath armor or the exhaustion tightening muscles. They saw posture, motion, and symbol. They saw honor in its visible form. This distance between appearance and experience allowed the tournament to function. It protected the illusion that courage was effortless and glory was clean. Yet beneath this illusion, the human cost persisted, quietly borne by those who wore the armor. In reflecting on this, there is a gentle lesson embedded within the medieval spectacle. Humans have always needed witnesses. We seek validation not only through achievement, but through recognition. The tournament formalized this need, creating a space where worth was measured in public acts. Glamour and ritual did not trivialize danger. They made it meaningful. They allowed individuals to face fear with the knowledge that their struggle mattered to others. As you rest with this thought, let it settle slowly. Imagine the crowd dispersing as dusk approaches, voices fading, banners lowered. The field returns to silence, marked only by tracks in the earth and memories carried away. Honor, so vivid moments before, now lives on in story rather than sight. In this transition, the true power of medieval tournaments reveals itself. They were not simply contests of strength, but carefully constructed moments where society agreed to witness vulnerability wrapped in splendor. And in doing so, they transformed fragile human lives into shared history, remembered long after the shine of armor dimmed. As the spectacle fades and the crowd begins to drift away, what remains on the tournament field is not glamour, but silence. The banners no longer flutter with purpose. The polished armor, once radiant under the sun, rests dull and scuffed against the earth. This is the moment medieval chronicles rarely linger on, the moment when honor, so carefully displayed, reveals the cost hidden beneath its shine. For all the ritual and symbolism, the tournament was built upon fragile human bodies, and no amount of metal could fully protect them. When armor was removed, reality returned quickly. Bruises darkened skin, joints ached under the memory of impact, cuts, often unseen during combat, revealed themselves slowly, stinging as mere touched flesh. Knights carried these injuries quietly because pain did not belong on the stage. The audience had already received what it came for. Glory had been witnessed, stories had been formed. What happened afterward was private, almost invisible, and yet deeply human. In this quiet aftermath, the illusion of invulnerability dissolved. Fear, too, emerged more clearly once the helmet was lifted. During the tournament, fear had been disciplined, shaped by ritual and expectation. Afterward, it surfaced in memory, the near misses, the moment when balance nearly failed, the sound of steel striking too close. Medieval sources often celebrate courage, but courage does not exist without fear. It is fear that gives bravery its weight, and beneath the armor, knights knew this intimately. They returned home carrying not only scars on their bodies, but impressions on their minds, reminders of how narrow the distance between honor and death truly was. This hidden cost extended beyond the individual. Families waited anxiously at the edges of these events, aware that spectacle carried risk. A tournament victory could elevate a household's name, but an injury or death could unravel its future. Wealth spent on armor and clothing was an investment, but also a gamble. The very symbols that promised stability and prestige were bound to uncertainty. In this way, medieval tournaments reflected a broader truth about status and display. The more honor was made visible, the more vulnerable it became. As night deepens, there is a gentle clarity in recognizing this balance. Medieval society did not ignore fragility, it managed it through ceremony. Armor was not simply protection, it was reassurance. It allowed knights to step into danger with structure around them, even if that structure could not eliminate risk. The shine of metal did not deny mortality, it distracted from it long enough for courage to emerge. And perhaps that is why tournaments remained compelling despite their danger. They offered a controlled way to confront the realities everyone understood, but rarely named. In the quiet after the crowd has gone, Honor changes shape. It no longer needs witnesses. It settles into memory, into stories told later, into lessons passed down. The knight who survived carried with him not just praise, but humility. The knight who fell became part of a narrative larger than himself. In both cases, the individual dissolved into history, absorbed by the same process that had transformed danger into meaning. As you rest with this thought, allow the final image of the tournament to soften. Imagine the field empty now, the grass pressed flat where hooves once thundered, the air cool and still. The shine is gone, but the truth remains. Honor was never only about brilliance, it was about endurance, about facing vulnerability openly, even when hidden beneath armor. Medieval tournaments remind us that beneath every polished surface in history lies a human cost, quietly paid, rarely displayed, yet essential to the stories that survive. And so, as this chapter comes to a close, the deeper understanding lingers. History may favor what glitters, but meaning often lives where the light fades. Beneath the medal, beneath the symbols, beneath the applause, there was always a human being, breathing, fearing, and hoping that the honor they wore would be worth the weight it carried.
Once a year in ancient Rome, the world loosened its grip on order. For a few brief days, rules softened, hierarchies blurred, and the familiar rhythm of authority stepped quietly aside. This moment was called Saturnalia, and it was unlike anything else in Roman life. In a society built on discipline, law, and rigid social structure, Saturnalia allowed laughter to replace command and play to interrupt power. It was not a rebellion nor a revolution. It was something far more subtle. A pause, a collective breath taken by an empire that understood, perhaps instinctively, that order could not exist without release. During Saturnalia, masters served slaves, at least symbolically. Formal greetings dissolved into jokes, harsh rules softened into games of chance. Dice were brought out openly, even though gambling was normally restricted. People wore informal clothing instead of the stiff garments of status. The pileus, a simple felt cap associated with freedom, appeared on heads across the city. These gestures were temporary, carefully bounded by time, yet powerful in meaning. They reminded everyone, from senator to servant, that the structures governing daily life were human creations, not unbreakable truths. As night settles gently around you, imagine Rome during these days. The usual tension of obedience and expectation lifts. Streets echo with laughter instead of footsteps measured by duty. Voices rise freely, no longer weighed down by rank. Even insults, usually dangerous in a society obsessed with honor, are permitted as playful exchanges. This inversion of norms did not weaken Rome, it strengthened it. Saturnalia functioned as a pressure valve, releasing the quiet strain built up by constant discipline. By acknowledging chaos briefly, Roman society made order bearable for the rest of the year. What makes Saturnalia so deeply human is that it did not pretend equality could last. Everyone understood the limits. When the festival ended, roles would return, slaves would resume obedience, masters would reclaim authority. The laughter would fade, and the law would reassert itself. And yet, during those fleeting days, something essential happened. People experienced a version of life unbound by rigid expectation, not as a permanent state, but as a reminder that hierarchy was maintained by agreement and repetition, not nature itself. This awareness lingered beneath the celebration. Saturnalia did not erase suffering or injustice. It illuminated them by contrast. By briefly allowing freedom, Rome revealed how carefully controlled daily life truly was. In doing so, the festival acknowledged a truth few societies openly admit: that order requires constant effort, that discipline is learned, enforced, and rehearsed, and that without moments of release, the system itself risks collapse under its own weight. As you listen, perhaps growing calmer with each phrase, consider how carefully Saturnalia was contained. Chaos was allowed, but only within a frame. The festival had a beginning and an end. This boundary was crucial. It ensured that the experience of freedom did not threaten stability, but instead reinforced it. After Saturnalia, order returned not as an imposition, but as a familiar structure willingly accepted again. People resumed their roles with renewed tolerance, having tasted what lay beyond them. In this way, Saturnalia reveals a quiet wisdom within Roman culture. The empire did not rely solely on force to maintain control. It relied on understanding human nature. It recognized that people need moments where the rules loosen, where identity becomes playful, where power is briefly mocked rather than feared. These moments did not undermine authority, they refreshed it. The laughter of Saturnalia echoed softly through the year, making obedience feel less suffocating. And so, as this first part of our journey into Saturnalia comes to rest, let one thought settle gently. Perhaps the most enduring strength of Rome was not its armies or laws, but its ability to acknowledge the human need for release. In allowing the world to turn upside down just for a moment, Rome ensured that when it turned back, people were ready to stand upright again. Order, after all, is not natural, it is chosen, and sometimes it can only be chosen after it has been briefly set aside. As Saturnalia settled into the streets of Rome, the festival moved beyond grand ideas of inversion and entered the intimate spaces of everyday life. This was where its true character emerged, not in official decrees or symbolic gestures alone, but in laughter shared over simple meals, in small gifts exchanged without obligation, and in conversations that normally would have remained unspoken. Saturnalia was experienced differently by each person, yet its atmosphere flowed through the city like warm light, touching households regardless of rank. Ordinary Romans, who lived much of the year under careful restraint, found themselves breathing more freely, speaking more openly, and moving through familiar spaces with a gentler sense of time. Food played a central role in this shift. Meals during Saturnalia were less formal, less governed by rigid etiquette. Families and neighbors gathered not to perform status, but to enjoy abundance together. Simple dishes became celebrations, and even modest tables felt generous. Wine flowed more easily, not to excess, but to warmth. Conversation loosened. Stories were told without fear of judgment. In these moments, Saturnalia felt less like a festival imposed from above and more like a shared understanding that joy itself was necessary for survival. The laughter that rose from these gatherings was not rebellious, it was restorative. Gift-giving added another layer of meaning to the season. Small tokens, often inexpensive and symbolic, were exchanged among friends and family. These gifts were not meant to impress, they were meant to acknowledge connection. Figurines, candles, writing tools, or simple sweets carried messages of goodwill rather than obligation. In a society where relationships were often defined by hierarchy and duty, Saturnalia briefly allowed generosity without calculation. Giving became an expression of presence rather than power. For a few days, value was measured not by wealth or rank, but by thoughtfulness. For slaves, Saturnalia carried a particularly complex emotional weight.
While freedom remained symbolic and temporary, the change in tone mattered. Masters dined with them. Jokes crossed boundaries usually enforced with severity. The gesture did not erase inequality, but it acknowledged humanity. This acknowledgement, fleeting as it was, revealed something important about Roman society. Even within a rigid system, there was an understanding that absolute control required moments of softness. Saturnalia did not promise justice, it offered recognition, and for many, that recognition was deeply felt. Children, too, experienced Saturnalia differently. The festival introduced play into a world otherwise shaped by discipline and expectation. Toys, games, and laughter filled streets and homes. Time seemed to slow for them, unmeasured by labor or responsibility. In their joy, we see how Saturnalia functioned as a reset, reminding adults of the simple pleasures that order often suppresses. These memories lingered long after the festival ended, becoming quiet sources of resilience during the long months that followed. As night deepens around you, consider how these ordinary moments gave Saturnalia its power, not through excess, but through permission. Permission to speak freely, permission to enjoy without justification, permission to be briefly unguarded. The festival did not change laws or structures, but it changed how people felt within them. It softened edges, released tension, and allowed emotional balance to return. In doing so, Saturnalia demonstrated that societies survive not only through control, but through carefully timed compassion. When the festival drew to a close, these experiences did not vanish entirely. They settled into memory, becoming reference points against which daily life was measured. The return to order felt less absolute because people had tasted an alternative, however brief. Saturnalia did not weaken Roman authority, it humanized it. By allowing joy and equality to exist temporarily, the system reaffirmed its own endurance. The quiet wisdom of this arrangement lies in its honesty. It acknowledged that humans cannot live indefinitely under pressure without release. As you rest with this thought, let the image of Rome during Saturnalia soften into calm. Lantern light flickers, voices fade into gentle conversation, laughter dissolves into quiet smiles. The city prepares to return to its familiar rhythms, not resentful, but restored. Perhaps the most unsettling truth of Saturnalia is not that chaos appeared, but that it was welcomed, organized, and then gently set aside. In this careful dance between freedom and order, we glimpse a society that understood something timeless, that to accept structure, people must sometimes be allowed to step outside it, and that the silence after laughter can be both comforting and necessary, preparing the world to turn upright once more.
As Saturnalia reached its most playful days, the inversion of roles moved beyond symbolism and into behavior. Laughter grew bolder. Jokes crossed lines that during the rest of the year would have been dangerous to approach. Masters listened while slaves spoke freely. Authority stepped back just enough to be visible in its absence. Yet beneath this apparent freedom lay careful boundaries. Saturnalia was never true chaos. It was rehearsed disorder, allowed precisely because it was temporary and understood by all. The reversal of roles was not designed to dismantle hierarchy, but to expose it gently. When slaves were permitted to speak openly, everyone could hear the difference between silence enforced and silence chosen. When masters served food or accepted mockery, the gesture highlighted how unusual such behavior truly was. The humor of Saturnalia depended on contrast. Without the rigid structure of daily Roman life, the joke would lose its meaning. Inversion worked because it was brief, framed, and expected to end.
This balance created a unique emotional tension. Laughter carried both relief and restraint. Participants understood that words spoken in jest still echoed beyond the festival. Certain truths could be hinted at but not fully declared. Insults were allowed, but only when softened by humor. Freedom existed, but always with an awareness of return. This awareness shaped behavior, keeping Saturnalia playful rather than dangerous. It allowed expression without collapse. For many Romans, this temporary reversal served as a mirror. Masters glimpsed what it felt like to be addressed casually. Slaves experienced what it meant to be heard, even briefly. Neither side mistook the experience for permanence. Yet the memory lingered. It complicated relationships. It introduced empathy where routine had dulled perception. Saturnalia did not equalize society, but it reminded it that hierarchy was maintained through constant performance, not inevitability. As night deepens, imagine conversations unfolding under torchlight. A slave jokes about his master's habits. Laughter follows, but it is measured. A master smiles, aware of both the permission and its limits. These exchanges carry an unspoken understanding. Tomorrow, order will return. Today, however, the roles loosen just enough to breathe. This delicate balance prevented resentment from erupting while avoiding genuine upheaval. What is striking about Saturnalia is how precisely it navigated danger. Roman society understood that suppressed voices do not disappear, they gather weight. By allowing controlled expression, the festival reduced the risk of uncontrolled revolt. Humor became a tool of stability. Play became a form of maintenance. In this way, Saturnalia reveals a sophisticated understanding of social pressure long before modern psychology would name it. Yet there is a quiet melancholy beneath the laughter. The freedom tasted during Saturnalia could never be fully claimed. It was borrowed time. When the festival ended, silence returned, heavier because it had been briefly lifted. The joke ended, the mask came off, roles reasserted themselves with renewed clarity. And still, the memory of inversion lingered, reminding everyone of what could exist, even if it could not remain. As you rest with this thought, allow it to soften rather than disturb. Saturnalia was not cruel in its limits, it was honest. It acknowledged human longing for expression while affirming the reality of structure. The festival did not promise liberation, it offered relief. And sometimes relief is what allows people to endure what cannot yet be changed. In this careful choreography of reversal and return, Saturnalia teaches a quiet lesson. Societies survive not by eliminating tension, but by managing it with awareness. By letting the world tilt just enough to remind its inhabitants that balance is chosen, not given. And when the world stands upright again, it does so not through force alone, but through shared understanding.
When the final day of Saturnalia passed, Rome did not collapse into confusion. It grew quiet. The laughter receded. The jokes lost their echo. Dice were put away. Informal clothing folded and returned to chests. One by one, the visible signs of inversion disappeared, replaced by the familiar posture of order. This return was not abrupt, nor was it violent. It was calm, almost ceremonial. And in that calm, something deeper revealed itself. The most unsettling part of Saturnalia was never the chaos. It was the silence that followed. In the days after the festival, Romans resumed their roles with remarkable ease. Masters reclaimed authority. Slaves returned to obedience. Laws regained their weight. On the surface, it seemed as though nothing had changed. Yet beneath this smooth transition lay an emotional afterimage. People carried the memory of laughter into quieter spaces. They remembered conversations spoken without fear, gestures offered without calculation. The contrast made daily life feel sharper, more defined. Order returned not as an abstract rule, but as a chosen condition, accepted with renewed clarity. This acceptance was the hidden achievement of Saturnalia. By allowing disorder to exist briefly, Roman society strengthened its relationship with structure. The festival did not undermine authority, it recalibrated it. Silence after Saturnalia was not empty, it was full of understanding. It held the knowledge that freedom had been tasted and deliberately set aside. This choice transformed obedience into participation. People complied not because they were unaware of alternatives, but because they understood the cost of constant inversion. The emotional rhythm of Saturnalia mirrors a universal human pattern. We seek intensity, release, and expression, but we also seek stability. Too much chaos exhausts. Too much order suffocates. The Roman solution was not to eliminate either, but to alternate between them. Saturnalia provided the release. The silence afterward restored balance. In that silence, society breathed out and then settled again, prepared to endure another cycle of discipline. There is something deeply calming in recognizing this pattern. It suggests that order does not have to be enforced relentlessly to survive. It can be maintained through understanding. By acknowledging human limits, Roman culture avoided the brittleness that breaks under pressure. The quiet days following Saturnalia allowed emotions to settle, relationships to normalize, and expectations to realign. The laughter was gone, but its memory softened the edges of authority. As night deepens and your thoughts slow, imagine Rome in this moment. The streets are quieter now. Lamps glow steadily rather than flicker with excitement. Conversations return to measured tones. The city feels grounded, almost heavier, yet strangely at peace. This is not repression, it is restoration. Saturnalia has done its work. It has reminded people of what lies beneath roles and laws, and then gently returned those roles to their place. The unsettling feeling lingers because it touches something fundamental. Freedom, once experienced, cannot be forgotten. Yet forgetting is not the goal. Saturnalia did not aim to erase. It relied on it. The memory of inversion made order intelligible. The silence after laughter carried meaning precisely because it followed sound. In this way, Roman society used contrast as a tool of endurance. As this chapter closes, let one final thought settle quietly. Perhaps the most human aspect of Saturnalia was not its celebration, but its ending, the willingness to step back into structure after stepping out of it, the understanding that freedom to be meaningful must sometimes be limited, and that silence, far from being empty, can be the space where acceptance forms. Rome did not fear the brief turning of its world upside down. It trusted that afterward, people would choose to stand it upright again.
Some figures in history are remembered for what they built. Cities, laws, monuments, ideas that endured quietly across centuries. Others are remembered not for construction, but for disruption, for moments when restraint dissolved and power stopped whispering. Valeria Messalina belongs to the second memory. Her life did not unfold slowly. It burned quickly, intensely, and without apology, leaving behind a trail of fascination, discomfort, and enduring debate. To understand her story is not to judge it, but to listen carefully to what happens when power is no longer content to remain unseen. Messalina entered history very young, married to the Roman Emperor Claudius while still in her teens. In a world where women of power were expected to influence quietly from behind curtains, she stood in a dangerous position, close enough to authority to shape it, yet officially excluded from its formal structures. Rome was a society that tolerated female influence only when it remained discreet. Messalina did not accept discretion. She lived at the center of the imperial court with an intensity that unsettled those around her. Her presence was not silent, it was noticed. Ancient sources describe her as ambitious, impulsive, and unapologetically assertive. Whether these descriptions are fair or exaggerated is difficult to know. Roman historians were rarely neutral when writing about powerful women. Yet even through layers of bias, one pattern emerges clearly. Messalina refused invisibility. She moved openly within networks of power, forging alliances, removing rivals, and shaping outcomes with a boldness usually reserved for men. This visibility was her strength, but it would also become her greatest vulnerability. As night deepens and your thoughts begin to slow, imagine the atmosphere of the imperial palace. Marble halls, polished floors, whispers moving faster than footsteps. Every gesture observed, every relationship interpreted. In such a place, silence was often the safest strategy. Messalina chose sound instead. Her actions echoed through court life, drawing attention in a system that punished those who attracted too much of it. Power in Rome was designed to be exercised indirectly. When exercised openly, it disrupted the balance that kept the system stable. Messalina's youth amplified this disruption. She did not rise slowly into influence. She arrived already near the peak, without the gradual acclimation that might have taught restraint. Surrounded by ambition and indulgence, she lived quickly, testing boundaries with confidence that seemed immune to consequence. To her supporters, she was decisive and fearless. To her enemies, she was reckless and dangerous. In truth, she was both, navigating a structure that offered power without protection. What makes her story so compelling is not excess alone, but contrast. Rome was an empire obsessed with order, hierarchy, and appearance. Public virtue mattered deeply, even when private behavior contradicted it. Messalina's refusal to perform modesty challenged this cultural performance. She made visible what was meant to remain hidden: desire, influence, manipulation. By embodying these forces openly, she violated an unspoken rule more dangerous than any written law. She exposed the mechanics of power itself. This is where her story shifts from scandal to symbol. Messalina represents a moment when the imperial system confronted its own contradictions. A woman wielded influence too openly, too loudly, and the system responded not with reform, but with memory. History remembered her not as a builder, but as a warning. Her life became a narrative shaped by excess, cautionary tone, and moral judgment. Yet beneath that narrative lies a quieter truth. She tested the limits of a structure never designed to accommodate her visibility. As you rest with this thought, allow the pace to soften. Messalina's life is often told loudly, filled with accusation and drama. Tonight, we approach it gently, not to sensationalize, but to observe. When power stops whispering, it reveals the boundaries of the world it inhabits. Messalina did not invent those boundaries. She collided with them. And in doing so, she ensured that history would remember her, not because it wished to, but because it could not look away.
As Messalina's presence at court grew more visible, power stopped being something she merely touched and became something she tested. In the imperial world of Rome, Influence was meant to move quietly, hidden behind favors, marriages, and carefully chosen silences. Valeria Messalina moved differently. She acted as though proximity to the throne granted immunity, as though access itself could replace restraint. This belief, subtle at first, shaped the rhythm of her life. Decisions came faster, boundaries blurred. What had once felt daring began to feel normal. Power, when experienced without consequence, has a way of distorting perception. Messalina lived in an environment where desires were indulged and obstacles could be removed. Rivals disappeared from favor. Allies rose suddenly. The machinery of the court responded to her will often enough to suggest that the system itself bent toward her. This illusion of control is one of the most dangerous gifts power can offer. It creates a sense of inevitability, a feeling that momentum alone will carry one forward. Messalina began to move as though limits no longer applied, as though the rules that governed others were optional in her case. Roman historians later framed this period as excess, but excess is only part of the story. Beneath the dramatic accounts lies a quieter process. Power became personal. It was no longer about influence within a system, but about reshaping the system to accommodate desire. Pleasure, ambition, and authority intertwined, reinforcing one another. Each successful maneuver reduced caution. Each unchallenged action weakened the instinct for restraint. In this way, power did not shout, it whispered reassurance, promising safety where none truly existed. The court itself encouraged this illusion. Rome's imperial center thrived on spectacle and intrigue. Those who benefited from Messalina's favor had little reason to challenge her. Silence, once a protective strategy, became complicity. Warnings softened. Criticism retreated into private conversations that never reached her ears. In such an atmosphere, it became increasingly difficult to distinguish loyalty from fear. Messalina's confidence grew not only from her own actions, but from the absence of resistance around her. As night settles and your breathing slows, imagine the palace during these years. Lamps burn late. Conversations linger. Decisions are made in small rooms where consequences feel distant. In this enclosed world, reality narrows. The wider empire with its laws and expectations feels abstract. Power becomes intimate, immediate, and intoxicating. Messalina's life accelerated within this bubble, each step reinforcing the belief that she was untouchable. Yet the Roman system was never designed to tolerate overt control by someone outside its formal authority. The emperor's power was absolute in theory, but even he was bound by tradition and perception. Messalina's influence, exercised openly and relentlessly, disrupted the delicate balance that kept the court stable. What had once been tolerated as private indulgence began to appear as a threat. Not because it broke written laws, but because it exposed how fragile those laws were. This is the quiet turning point of her story. Not the moment of downfall, but the moment when perception shifted, when power stopped feeling contained and began to feel excessive. Roman society was skilled at absorbing contradiction, but it was intolerant of imbalance. When desire and authority fused too visibly, the system responded not with immediate punishment, but with preparation. Networks adjusted, loyalties recalibrated. The same silence that once protected Messalina began to move against her. As you rest with this thought, there is something deeply human to recognize here. Messalina did not set out to destroy the system that elevated her. She trusted it. She believed it would continue to accommodate her presence. In this trust lay her vulnerability. Power, when mistaken for permanence, invites its own correction. The Roman court did not need to confront her directly at first. It only needed to remember its own rules. Part 2 ends not with action, but with tension, a sense of gathering weight. Messalina still moved freely, still acted boldly, still believed in the safety of her position. But beneath the surface, the balance had shifted. The illusion of control remained intact only because it had not yet been challenged. And in history, it is often this moment, the quiet before response, that matters most. Because once power stops whispering, the echo is heard by everyone.
Every system has a moment when it stops observing and begins responding. For Messalina, that moment did not arrive with sudden force. It arrived quietly, disguised as routine. Appointments shifted, conversations shortened, allies hesitated before speaking. The court did not confront her openly, it adjusted around her. This was how Roman power worked when it sensed imbalance, not through immediate punishment, but through subtle withdrawal. Valeria Messalina continued to act with confidence, yet the ground beneath that confidence had begun to change. What made this phase so dangerous was its invisibility. There were no public accusations, no formal charges. Instead, there was a recalibration of loyalty. Those who had once benefited from Messalina's favor began to calculate risk. The same instincts that had drawn them close now urged distance. Influence, once abundant, became conditional. Requests took longer to fulfill. Assurances felt less certain. In a court built on perception, these shifts mattered more than proclamations. The Roman system did not need to declare opposition to weaken her position. It relied on tradition, memory, and the quiet authority of precedent. Power in Rome was not only about who commanded, but about who appeared inevitable. As Messalina's actions grew more visible, inevitability began to erode. Her confidence, once a sign of strength, started to look like exposure. In a culture that valued control through restraint, openness invited scrutiny. As night deepens and the cadence of this story slows, imagine the palace during this turning. Corridors feel longer, familiar faces feel distant. The sound of one's own footsteps becomes more noticeable. Messalina was not yet isolated, but she was no longer surrounded by unquestioning support. The system had begun to remind her of its scale. Individual will, no matter how forceful, remained smaller than the structure it moved within. This response was not personal, it was procedural. Roman authority had endured by outlasting individuals, not by confronting them directly. When imbalance appeared, it allowed time to do its work. Networks shifted, narratives formed. The story of Messalina began to harden in whispered retellings, framed less by her achievements and more by their consequences. Reputation, once a shield, became a weight. There is a quiet inevitability to this stage, not because Messalina lacked intelligence or awareness, but because the system she navigated did not reward adaptation once visibility had crossed a certain threshold. Retrenchment was no longer possible. Silence, once an option, had been abandoned too thoroughly. The court did not need to silence her, it needed only to wait for her actions to confirm the story it was preparing to tell. As you rest with this thought, notice how restraint operates in history. Systems rarely act in anger, they act in preservation. The Roman response to Messalina was not fueled by outrage, but by the instinct to restore balance. Her presence had grown too loud for a structure designed to function through understatement. The correction began not with force, but with memory, comparison, and quiet consensus. Part 3 ends here, in the space where action still continues, but outcome is no longer uncertain. Messalina moved forward believing in momentum, while the system moved differently, slower, and wider. This difference in scale is what ultimately defines power. Actions take place, but systems endure. And when the two fall out of alignment, history does not rush. It waits, recording each step with patient clarity.
There is always a moment in history that feels strangely calm, even as consequences gather just beyond sight. For Valeria Messalina, this moment arrived not with alarm, but with routine. Life at court continued, ceremonies unfolded. Power still answered when summoned, though with less enthusiasm than before. From the outside, nothing appeared broken. From within, the silence had changed its texture. It was no longer protective, it was anticipatory. Messalina still moved through the palace with confidence, but it was a confidence sustained by momentum rather than support. She had passed the point where withdrawal was possible, yet had not reached the point of confrontation. This in-between state is one of the most dangerous positions any powerful figure can occupy. It feels stable because it has not yet collapsed. It feels familiar because the structure remains intact, and yet its foundations have already begun to shift. What makes this phase so difficult to detect is that it resembles success. Access remains, influence persists, decisions are still made, but something essential is missing: confirmation. The small signals that once reassured her of alignment have faded. Smiles linger a moment too briefly. Responses arrive without warmth. Agreements feel procedural rather than personal. The court has not rejected her. It has absorbed her and begun to neutralize her presence. Roman power rarely announced its judgments in advance. It allowed individuals to continue until their actions completed the narrative already forming around them. In Messalina's case, this narrative had hardened quietly. She was no longer seen as a participant in the system, but as a problem to be resolved by it. This shift did not require evidence in the modern sense. It required coherence, a story that explained excess, disruption, and imbalance in terms the system could accept. As night deepens and your breathing slows, imagine the weight of this realization pressing gently but steadily. Messalina sensed change, but sensing is not the same as understanding. Power had always responded to her before. It was reasonable to expect it would continue to do so. The illusion persisted because it had always been reinforced by experience. History rarely warns those who are about to fall. It allows them to keep walking. This moment before collapse is often misunderstood. It is not marked by panic, but by repetition. The same strategies are tried again despite diminishing returns. The same assumptions guide decisions even as conditions change. Messalina continued to act boldly, not because she was unaware of danger, but because boldness had always worked. The system, however, had moved on. It was no longer responding to action.
It was preparing to conclude. What is striking here is not cruelty, but impersonality. The Roman system did not hate Messalina. It did not fear her in the way individuals fear rivals. It evaluated her. And once that evaluation shifted, the outcome became a matter of timing rather than debate. This is how institutions preserve themselves, not through emotion, but through continuity. As you rest with this thought, allow the pace to soften further. There is no drama yet, no sudden rupture, only the slow narrowing of possibility. Messalina's world had not ended, but it had stopped expanding. Options closed quietly, alternatives faded. The path forward became singular, though it still appeared open. This part ends here in suspension. Power still moves, influence still breathes, but the future has already been written in outline. The fall has not occurred, yet its shape is visible to history, if not to those living within it. And this is where our story pauses, not at the moment of destruction, but at the final calm before it. Because sometimes the most revealing moment in any life is not the fall itself, but the instant before it, when everything still looks possible and nothing yet feels inevitable. There was once a place where humanity attempted something quietly audacious. Not conquest, not spectacle, but remembrance. A belief that knowledge, once gathered, could outlast empires. This place was the Library of Alexandria, and its ambition was simple, almost gentle, to hold the world not in power, but in understanding. Unlike palaces or arenas, the library did not shine with armor or echoes with applause. Its daring lay elsewhere, in shelves, in scrolls, in the patient act of copying words so they would not disappear. It was founded on the idea that human thought itself was worth preserving, even when it contradicted authority, tradition, or belief. This alone made it radical. The library gathered texts from across the known world, philosophy from Greece, mathematics from Babylon, medicine from Egypt, stories, observations, arguments, doubts. Ships arriving in Alexandria were searched not for weapons, but for books. Originals were kept, copies returned. Knowledge flowed inward, accumulating quietly, like sediment forming a foundation beneath history. As night settles and your breathing slows, imagine the atmosphere inside those halls. Not loud, not dramatic, scholars moving softly, lamps casting warm light across papyrus, minds at work not for fame, but for continuity. This was not a place of immediate reward. It was a wager against time itself, a belief that future generations would matter. And this belief carried risk. Knowledge is never neutral. To collect it is to challenge forgetting. To preserve it is to resist control. The library represented a subtle defiance. It suggested that truth did not belong to rulers alone, nor to priests, nor to victors. It belonged to anyone willing to read. In this way, the library fits perfectly into the long arc of our story, from Leonardo's sketches that ran ahead of history, to knights wearing honor as armor, to festivals where order dissolved, to power exercised too openly. Each moment reflects a human urge to go further than the present allows. The library dared in silence. It dared to believe that memory itself could be institutionalized. Yet institutions are fragile when they depend on tolerance. The library did not fall because knowledge was false. It fell because knowledge was inconvenient. Empires shift, priorities harden. What once seemed essential begins to look dangerous. The library's vast collection became a liability, not because of what it contained, but because of what it represented: independent thought, accumulated perspective, a past that could question the present. There was no single dramatic ending, no singular flame that erased everything at once. Instead, there was erosion, neglect, political change, religious tension, the slow unraveling of support. Scrolls vanished, not in one night, but over generations, and with them disappeared voices we will never hear again, questions we will never know were asked. As you drift deeper into rest, consider this quietly unsettling idea. Humanity once stood close to holding a more complete record of itself, not perfection, not certainty, but continuity. And then, little by little, it let that record slip away, not through malice alone, but through indifference, fear, and shifting values. This is not a story of tragedy meant to alarm. It is a story meant to soften us, to remind us that daring does not always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looks like preservation. And preservation, in the long view of history, can be just as threatening as revolution. Part 1 ends here, not with destruction, but with intention, with a moment when humanity believed it could remember itself, before that belief was tested, before silence returned to the shelves.
At a certain point in history, memory itself began to feel like a threat, not because it was inaccurate, but because it was too complete. The quiet ambition of the Library of Alexandria had always rested on an assumption that knowledge could exist without consequence, that books could simply be books, that ideas could be gathered and preserved without unsettling the structures that governed daily life. For a time, this assumption held, but as power shifted, memory changed its meaning. Empires are built on selective remembrance. They thrive by emphasizing certain stories and allowing others to fade. The library disrupted this balance by refusing to forget. It preserved contradictions, competing philosophies, observations that challenged myth, calculations that undermined superstition. In doing so, it quietly expanded the range of what could be questioned, and questioning in any age carries risk. As the political and religious climate around Alexandria evolved, tolerance narrowed. New authorities brought new priorities. What had once been admired as curiosity began to be viewed as defiance. Knowledge that did not serve immediate stability became suspect. The library's strength, its breadth and openness, turned into its vulnerability. Memory, when it refuses to align with power, becomes dangerous. This danger did not announce itself dramatically. There were no universal decrees declaring knowledge forbidden. Instead, support eroded, funding diminished, protection weakened, scholars dispersed. The institution was not attacked as an enemy, but neglected as an inconvenience. In history, neglect is often more effective than destruction. It leaves no clear villain, no singular moment of loss, only absence. As you settle deeper into rest, imagine shelves growing quieter, fewer hands copying texts, lamps left unlit, scrolls aging without attention. Each small omission compounded over time. Memory does not vanish all at once. It thins, it fragments. It becomes harder to access, then harder to justify preserving. Eventually, it becomes expendable. What makes this process so unsettling is its familiarity. The loss of the library was not the result of one catastrophic decision, but of many small ones, each seemingly reasonable, each justified by immediate concerns: stability, order, unity.
In choosing these, humanity did not reject knowledge outright, it postponed it, and in postponement, it lost more than it realized. This is where the library's story connects back to the larger arc we have been following. Leonardo's sketches were too early, medieval honor was too theatrical, Saturnalia was too free, Messalina's power was too visible, and the library's memory was too expansive. In every case, humans reached beyond the comfort of their moment, sometimes with brilliance, sometimes with excess, always with consequence. The disappearance of so much recorded thought did not end curiosity. Humans continued to ask questions, to invent, to imagine, but they did so with fewer echoes from the past, fewer guides. The silence left behind shaped what followed. Gaps in knowledge redirected inquiry. Lost texts narrowed possibility. The future was built, but on a thinner foundation. As your breathing slows further, consider how fragile continuity truly is. Memory requires protection, not only from fire or decay, but from disinterest. The library teaches us that daring does not always look like action. Sometimes it looks like preservation, and preservation requires sustained care. Without it, even the most ambitious attempt to hold the world can quietly slip away. Part 2 ends here, not with flames or ruin, but with thinning voices, with a realization that memory, once seen as a gift, can become a liability when it challenges control. And in that realization lies a question that continues to echo through history. How much of ourselves are we willing to remember when remembering asks us to change?
When people speak of the Library of Alexandria, they often speak in absolutes, as though everything vanished at once, as though human memory suffered a single, clean amputation. But history is rarely so decisive. What was lost disappeared unevenly, quietly, in fragments. Some texts survived by chance, others by copying, others by being carried far away from the place that first held them. Loss did not arrive as an ending, it arrived as a thinning, and what remained was shaped by that thinning in subtle ways that still echo today. The absence of so much recorded thought did not leave an empty space. It left a landscape altered by erosion, where paths once visible became faint, and where future travelers had to invent new routes without knowing what had been there before. Consider how knowledge moves when continuity breaks. Ideas do not simply stop, they adapt, they compress, they simplify. Complex debates become single conclusions, nuanced observations harden into rules. The world becomes easier to manage, but harder to understand. In this way, the loss of the library did not silence inquiry, it reshaped it. Human curiosity continued, but with fewer reference points, fewer reminders that questions had been asked before, and sometimes answered in ways now forgotten. What survived tended to align with power, tradition, or utility. What challenged those structures was less likely to be preserved. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine generations of thinkers working with partial maps of the past, building philosophies without knowing which alternatives had already been explored, repeating experiments whose earlier versions lay buried in lost scrolls. Progress continued, but it did so unevenly, doubling back on itself, circling questions that had once been part of a larger conversation. History moved forward, but not in a straight line. It curved, stalled, and restarted, shaped by what memory allowed it to retain. Yet not everything fragile disappears. Some ideas endure precisely because they can survive outside institutions. Oral traditions, practical techniques, observations embedded in craft and habit. While the library represented an attempt to centralize memory, its decline revealed another truth. Knowledge that lives only in one place is vulnerable. Knowledge that disperses, that embeds itself in daily life, can persist even when grand structures fail. In this sense, the human impulse to remember proved more resilient than any building. This resilience, however, comes with cost. What remains is often stripped of context. Techniques survive without the philosophies that once framed them. Practices endure without the debates that refined them. The result is a world that functions but does not fully recall how it learned to function. In this way, this partial memory shapes ambition. Humans continue to dare, but they do so without full awareness of previous limits tested, previous mistakes made, previous possibilities imagined and then abandoned. This pattern connects back through every chapter of our journey. Leonardo sketched machines that could not yet exist, his ideas surviving in notebooks rather than workshops. Medieval knights wore honor visibly, while the deeper meanings behind those rituals faded over time. Saturnalia inverted order briefly, but its deeper social commentary softened into celebration. Messalina exercised power boldly, yet history remembers her more as a warning than as a participant in a complex system. And the library sought to hold everything, only to leave behind fragments that still shape what we know. As your breathing slows and the edges of thought soften, consider the quiet courage required to preserve memory without certainty of reward. The scholars of Alexandria did not know which texts would matter most. They copied anyway. They gathered anyway. Their daring was not in prediction, but in trust. Trust that future minds would need access to the past, even if the present found it inconvenient. In losing so much of their work, humanity did not lose that impulse entirely. It lost clarity, but not intention. Part 3 rests here in reflection rather than resolution, between loss and survival, between what was erased and what endured. History does not move by perfect design. It moves by accumulation and forgetting, by daring and retreat. And in that uneven motion, it records not just what humans achieved, but what they risked losing when they dared to go further than their moment could safely hold.
Even after memory thins, even after knowledge scatters, humanity does not stop reaching. This persistence is one of the quiet constants of history. Civilizations lose texts, forget methods, misinterpret their own past, and yet the urge to understand returns again and again. Not because people remember exactly what was lost, but because something essential remains. A restlessness, a sense that there is always more just beyond what is currently known. After the disappearance of so much accumulated knowledge, the world did not fall silent. It grew curious in new ways. Thinkers worked with fragments, hints, and echoes. They rebuilt frameworks without blueprints, guided by intuition and necessity. In some eras, this rebuilding was slow and cautious. In others, it surged forward with confidence that bordered on audacity. Progress did not follow a straight path. It moved in waves, shaped by what survived and by what was reinvented. As you sink deeper into rest, consider how often humanity rediscovers ideas it once knew. Principles of mechanics, observations about the body, the movement of stars. These moments of rediscovery feel like breakthroughs, yet they are also reminders of earlier daring. Knowledge does not vanish completely. It hides. It waits in partial forms, embedded in craft, in language, in habit. When conditions allow, it reemerges, sometimes recognized, sometimes mistaken for novelty. This pattern helps explain why figures like Leonardo appear almost timeless. His sketches feel advanced, not because they came from nowhere, but because they resonated with long-standing questions humanity had been asking repeatedly. How do things move? How does nature solve problems? How can observation replace assumption? Leonardo's genius lay not only in invention, but in attention. He looked carefully, patiently at the world around him. In doing so, he reconnected threads that had been stretched thin by loss and forgetting. The same impulse appears in other chapters of our journey. Medieval tournaments transformed violence into ritual, attempting to give chaos a visible structure. Saturnalia offered controlled release, acknowledging pressures that could not be eliminated. Messalina tested the limits of power, revealing where the system would push back. And the library sought to hold memory itself, daring to believe continuity could be protected. In every case, humans did not settle for what existed. They pushed, adjusted, and tried again. What emerges from this pattern is not a narrative of failure, but of resilience. Loss does not end ambition, it reshapes it. When one path closes, another is attempted. When certainty fades, experimentation begins. History advances not because humanity remembers everything, but because it refuses to stop questioning. This refusal is quiet. It does not announce itself as rebellion. It shows up as curiosity, as craftsmanship, as study conducted late into the night. As your breathing slows further, let this thought rest gently. The daring that defines history is not always dramatic. Often it is repetitive. Humans dare to ask similar questions across centuries, each time hoping for clearer answers. Sometimes they succeed. Sometimes they lose what they gain. But the motion continues, forward, sideways, backward, and forward again. This persistence carries both promise and risk. Without memory, mistakes are repeated. Without context, power is misunderstood. Yet without daring, nothing new emerges. History is shaped by this tension between remembering and forgetting, between caution and reach. Humanity does not progress because it is wise. It progresses because it is restless. Part 4 settles here in recognition of that restlessness. The understanding that even when records are lost and systems fail, the impulse to go further remains. It waits for favorable conditions. It gathers strength quietly. And when the moment arrives, it dares once more. Not knowing exactly how far is too far, only knowing that standing still has never been enough. Every era asks the same question in different forms. Not aloud, not directly, but through action. How far can we go before something breaks? History never answers this question with clarity. It answers it with patterns, with echoes, with quiet reminders left behind in the aftermath of daring. From the beginning of our journey, humans have been reaching beyond what their moment could safely contain. Leonardo sketched machines before the world was ready to build them. Medieval knights wrapped violence in ritual, polishing armor until it gleamed like virtue. Romans surrendered order for a few nights of Saturnalia, tasting freedom before returning to hierarchy. Messalina stepped beyond the unspoken boundaries of power, discovering that visibility itself can become a threat. And finally, humanity attempted to gather all memory in one place, believing knowledge could be made permanent. None of these attempts were foolish. Each was born from curiosity, ambition, or the need to understand. And yet, each revealed a limit, not a fixed boundary, but a moving one. What was too far in one era became acceptable in another. What was celebrated briefly later became controlled.
History does not punish daring. It absorbs it, reshapes it, and carries it forward in altered form. As you drift deeper into rest, consider how gentle this realization actually is. There is no final warning carved into stone, no ultimate lesson declared at the end of time. Instead, there is repetition. Humanity tries, humanity adjusts, humanity tries again. Progress is not a straight ascent, it is a series of arcs, each rising with hope and falling into consequence. The question of too far is never answered in advance. It is only answered afterward when the cost becomes visible. And even then, the answer is incomplete, because what appears as excess from one angle appears as necessity from another. What seems reckless in hindsight may have felt essential in the moment. History understands this ambiguity. It records actions without resolving them. This is why history feels calm when told softly. When we stop demanding judgment, patterns emerge. We see that daring is not a flaw, but a feature of being human. Without it, there would be no invention, no ritual, no celebration, no challenge to power, no attempt to preserve memory. With it, there is risk, loss, forgetting, but also renewal. As your breathing slows and thoughts begin to loosen their grip, allow this idea to settle. Humanity has never known exactly how far is too far, and yet it continues to walk forward, sometimes guided by wisdom, sometimes by impulse, often by both at once. History does not correct this behavior, it chronicles it. And in that chronicle lies a quiet comfort. We are not alone in our uncertainty. Every generation stands at the edge of its own knowledge, peering outward, wondering what lies beyond. Sometimes it steps back, sometimes it steps forward. Either way, the movement itself becomes history. This series ends not with an answer, but with a recognition that history is not a straight line. It is a quiet record of how far humans dared to go, and how, even when they stumbled, they dared again. Now, as the night deepens, there is nothing left to decide, only to rest, to let the stories settle where they belong, and to remember, gently, that the question of how far is never meant to keep us awake. It is meant to remind us that daring, like history itself, is a companion we carry quietly into the dark.